Good morning. My name is John Mayo. I am a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown University in the McDonough School of Business. I'm also the executive director of our host, the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. We try very hard to strike a balance between being professional and being on time and understanding this is Washington. I had my own vision of what that timing was going to involve, but when Andrea Salvatore, our associate director, started shutting the doors, I realized that was a good time to go ahead and start. Today, what we're here to do is to talk about a study that has been released under the auspices of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. The title of the study is The Economic Implications of Restricting Spectrum Purchases in the Incentive Auctions. It's been co-authored by three very prominent economists, Robert Shapiro, Doug Holtz-Eakin, and Coleman Bazelon. They have very distinguished records of service both in the public sector and the private sector. Their bios are in the back of the study, so I won't belabor their long list of accomplishments. I'll simply refer you to that list. When I thought about what I should say by way of introductory remarks for today, I was struck by me telling some of my colleagues at Georgetown about this study and to telling them that the title of this study was, again, The Economic Implications of Restricting Spectrum Purchases in the Incentive Auctions. When I told my colleagues about that, a number of them had the same look that a young dog does when you call its name, and they sort of cocked their head with a look of saying, "What in the heck are you talking about?" So it struck me that while many of you are steeped in spectrum policy and the nuances of spectrum policy, some of you may not be. And so, with apologies to those of you who are steeped in this area, but paying attention to what, at least in the broad cross-section of the American public, is a larger set of people that really don't know a lot about spectrum policy. Let me just take a few minutes to tee up the study in terms of putting it in some historical context. Now, to do that, let me take you back 100 years. I promise we're going to get to the future very quickly. But if you think back about 100 years ago, we began in this country to use radio spectrum. We first used it on ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore technologies as a way of communicating wirelessly, and that's really what began the use of radio spectrum. That spectrum use grew from that simple use to the area of commercial radio, and then to over-the-air broadcast television, and much later to the development of cellular telephony, and most recently to mobile broadband. Now, for the vast majority of the history of this industry, the way spectrum has been allocated to users of spectrum has been through government fiat. Through the government simply saying, here whoever you is, you get to use spectrum. We'll decide and you get to use it. It was decided either by who arrived on the spectrum first, who asked first, who filled out the best application, the prettiest application, people refer to that as a beauty contest, or by just simply lottery. You got lucky and won a lottery, and so you get some spectrum. Now, it probably strikes you, it struck me, and it struck a lot of people, that is a way to allocate society's resources. It does get the job done, but it's not a particularly intuitively efficient way of getting it done. So it was against that backdrop that in 1959, an economist named Ronald Coase wrote a very prominent, now influential article in the Journal of Law and Economics, in which he made what in hindsight is a very obvious argument, but at the time was really radical. And the radical idea he offered at the time was the notion that instead of allocating spectrum to users by government fiat, that we could do a much better job in moving low-valued spectrum to high-valued uses if we would allow for a liberal auction. That is, an auction that says, we're opening this up. If you're a qualified bidder, come bid on the auction, and in competition with other bidders, we'll find out who values the spectrum most highly. Now, that article stimulated a set of research by economists, first in small numbers, then larger numbers, both theoretical research and empirical research, that led over the next decades to what was a small chorus, a small choir, let's say, and then a larger chorus of economists that began to sing the praise of these liberal auctions as a way of creating economic value for society. Now, the policy community got on board in the spectrum arena in the mid-1990s. It took a while. But in the mid-1990s, at the FCC, we began to run a series of open liberal auctions that allowed for bidders to bid for spectrum. And this has been spectacularly successful, with some notable exceptions of when restrictions were placed on the auctions. But the auctions have been, generally speaking, very, very successful. They've created tens of billions of dollars for the Treasury, and they have enabled the growth and flourishing of the cellular industry and now the mobile broadband industry. Now, again, I told you this is going to be a Cliff Notes version. Let me fast forward to the year 2007. In 2007, what happened? The iPhone happened, and we had a little inflection moment. We had an inflection moment, and as I said, it's a bit of a caricature, but the Apple iPhone helped usher in what we might think of as the apps economy. It generated a move from wireless communication being really voice only to voice, data, and video that we now all, a few years later, take for granted. But that communications, that broadband communications that we take for granted is by all accounts, spectrum intensive. It takes a lot of spectrum to carry voice, video, and data all on the same devices. That exploding demand, the burgeoning demand, was recognized in the National Broadband Plan in 2010 as something that needed to be addressed. The National Broadband Plan hatched an idea. The idea was to create what is sometimes referred to as an incentive auction, but it's really two auctions, the idea being that we could create an institution of incentive auctions, run two auctions that would move spectrum from low-valued uses in the over-the-air broadcast sector to higher valued uses in mobile telephony and mobile broadband. The idea was to run a reverse auction for the over-the-air broadcasters, where they would reveal the price at which they would voluntarily relinquish spectrum, and a corresponding auction after repacking by the FCC, a corresponding forward auction that would be conducted that would allow an open set of bidders to bid for that spectrum from the mobile broadband sector, or whoever wants to bid on that. And that was the idea. Now, it was a good idea, but it didn't have legislative authority, which was in fact only granted last year in 2012 under something called what was now referred to as the Spectrum Act. The FCC today is designing the set of rules under which those auctions will occur. It's very important to get the rules right and to understand the economic implications of the rule design. So what this particular study that we asked Robert Shapiro and Doug Holtz-Eakin and Coleman Bazelon to do is to look at what are the economic implications, macroeconomic implications of spectrum design, ranging from a more liberal open auction to a more restrictive auction. So I hope that tees it up for you. I'll let them talk specifically about the details of their study. And I think we had Rob, you going first. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've asked each of the speakers to do is to talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and this should allow ample time for questions and answers. The idea is to have an ample time for discussion. So let me turn it over to Rob.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Georgetown and the Center on Business and Public Policy for supporting this research, as they have supported other research that we've done in this general area. We all know that from our daily lives and from our business lives that mobile devices and applications have become genuine assets for businesses and for households. And their spread has driven improvements and innovations in both IT hardware and software. We also know that the introduction of new technologies and business methods to accompany them, which make businesses more efficient or which allow businesses to do things that they hadn't done before, will have effects on growth and on employment. And the implication of that, the result of that, is that government decisions which affect the use of those technologies will affect the economy. One such government decision is certainly the provision of additional spectrum for the use of mobile devices and the terms on which the FCC offers that spectrum. As John already noted, the FCC has announced its intention to conduct a two-part auction of additional spectrum, and my colleagues and I have analyzed some of the economic and revenue-related consequences of certain specific terms for that auction which have been proposed and which the FCC is considering. In particular, we examine the economic and revenue effects of excluding or restricting the two largest mobile providers, who happen to be AT&T and Verizon, from participating in this auction. The claim has been made that such an exclusion or restrictions could promote greater competition in mobile services. This is not an issue which we examine in this. Rather, and in part because, and in my view, this is not a claim that's actually based on actual evidence and analysis. So I don't explore the basis and viability of that claim. Instead, we simply analyze the effects of restrictions or exclusions from participating in this auction on consumers. I found in my analysis that excluding the two largest providers would reduce the efficiency of spectrum use, because the two largest carriers, for expected reasons of economies of scale and scope, make relatively more efficient use of spectrum. In fact, the top three make relatively more efficient use of spectrum. And therefore, excluding them would shift spectrum resources towards generally less efficient providers. As overall network efficiency is impaired under these assumptions, and mobile traffic continues to expand at rapid rates, exceeding the network's capacity, the wireless industry would be forced to ration spectrum, either through higher prices, which would be the expected way, or alternatively could try to avert network congestion by investing additional billions of dollars in other inputs such as additional cell towers. In either case, the price increases, and this is a précis of the overall analysis, would slow the adoption of 4G devices by households and businesses because it costs more, which in turn would reduce job gains associated with the broad adoption of new generation devices and infrastructure. We came to this conclusion by conducting a thought experiment. We started with two scenarios under which the two largest providers, one scenario, have unrestricted access to additional spectrum and could purchase up to all of it, and another under which those carriers are barred from purchasing additional spectrum. We do not assume that either scenario will occur. Rather, they create a hypothetical range for evaluating the impact of these restrictions. Less stringent restrictions, that is, in between all or nothing, should produce costs proportionate to the extent of those restrictions. Everyone agrees that we need to expand the spectrum available for wireless services because the current spectrum allocations cannot accommodate the expected increase in demand. Providers today have undertaken large investment programs. In 2011, for example, providers, and this is the entire industry, invested more than $25 billion in new cell towers, antennas, radio equipment, and other network infrastructure. The industry also has developed new technologies to increase the amount of data that can travel over a given unit of spectrum, including frequency reuse, automatic circuit switching, digital voice encoding, multiplexing, and so on. Incidentally, do not ask me any questions about the specifics of these. It's a series of black boxes to me. It's not enough, according to both the FCC and industry experts. That's why they've determined to free up an additional 300 megahertz of spectrum by 2015 and 500 megahertz by 2020. The first such auction is scheduled for next year, when a total of up to 120 megahertz is expected to be auctioned. And that auction is the focus of both my analysis and Doug's. This is not the first time, incidentally, that the FCC has considered restricting access to an auction or setting terms which distinguish between one bidder and another. In 1996, the Commission set aside the C-block spectrum for small businesses, and 89 applicants bid about $10 billion for 493 licenses. However, many of the successful bidders failed to make their payments, and many filed for bankruptcy. By 1998, 175 of the 493 licenses had been turned back to the FCC. So that effort to target spectrum to particular businesses or classes of businesses was judged to have failed. The FCC also has tried spectrum caps, but they abandoned them in 2003. To test the impact of returning to a regime of restrictions, this time we first forecast wireless spectrum demand over the next 5 years, and using the FCC's model to do this. We projected the trend growth rates over the previous 5 to 10 years of cell sites, of mobile data traffic, of average spectral efficiency gains, and of technology-adjusted traffic per site. This gave us the spectrum required to accommodate the demand for spectrum. And incidentally, all of those growth rates and assumptions are provided in the paper in a table in about the middle of the paper. This gave us the amount of spectrum required to accommodate the growing demand for spectrum, and from this we could calculate the shortfall in spectrum before this auction, that is, under the current allocations. This exercise showed that that deficit, spectrum deficit, would be about 36 megahertz this year, growing to 269 megahertz in 2014, 474 in 2015, 726 in 2016, and over 1,000 megahertz by 2017. And that's why the FCC has scheduled a series of auctions to release additional spectrum. We don't have enough in use today to accommodate anything like the growth of demand which everyone expects, even given the expected investment programs of the providers and technological improvements on the path that they've occurred in the recent past. And in practice, these deficits, which if unaddressed, that is without the allocation of additional spectrum, would lead to congestion, degraded service, and higher prices. But these deficits also depend on how providers use the spectrum, given all the advances and the investments which we assume in projecting the shortfalls. Using FCC data and information from company reports, we calculated as a measure of efficiency the ratio of subscribers per megahertz of wireless spectrum for the 7 largest carriers, and then for all carriers. How many subscribers does each carrier serve with a unit of spectrum? I expect to hear questions about this measure when we're done, but it is one which the wireless industry uses routinely and has been used routinely in industry submissions to the FCC. This analysis found that the three largest providers, Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint, are relatively more efficient in their use of spectrum by this measure than other smaller providers, restricting their access to spectrum. And this is not surprising. Again, this is the efficiencies you would expect to see from the development of large national networks. Restricting their access to additional spectrum, or access by 2 of the 3 as has been proposed, would reduce the overall efficiency of the network and the supply of mobile services, and therefore put upward pressure on prices paid by mobile providers. That's what we would expect. Next, we estimated the size of these effects under our 2 scenarios, allocating additional spectrum in proportion to the carrier's current share of customers. That is, that was the baseline, relative to which we were measuring the impact of the effects. We found that under the first scenario, where the 2 largest carriers can acquire the spectrum and could acquire up to all of the additional spectrum, the spectrum deficit would be about 16 megahertz lower than if the additional spectrum were allocated based on their customer shares. Again, I'm not advocating any of this. This is a hypothetical thought experiment. And the reason that the spectrum deficit goes down is because the 2 largest carriers are about 13% more efficient with their wireless spectrum than all 7 carriers considered as a group. Under the second scenario, in which the 2 largest providers are barred from acquiring additional spectrum, the spectrum deficit increases by 22 megahertz, again compared to the baseline. This reflects the fact that, on average, the 5 other providers are about 19% less efficient with their wireless spectrum than all 7 carriers as a group. When I say more or less efficient, there's nothing normative about implied in that. It's simply the nature of the different businesses. Following the FCC's practice, we then constructed what economists call an indifference curve that reflects the trade-off between acquiring additional spectrum and additional spending on network infrastructure. And these indifference curves are also in the report. Each point on the curve represents some combination of additional spectrum and additional network spending that would meet the projected demand that we projected in the first part of the analysis. For example, the 22 megahertz of capacity sacrificed by borrowing the 2 largest carriers from the auction translates into an additional $8 billion in infrastructure costs. That is, we would expect the carrier to be indifferent between that investment and the additional spectrum. We then repeated this analysis considering all the providers, not just the top 7. This brings in Clearwire and a variety of other smaller, less efficient providers. Using the same FCC models, this found that the 2 largest carriers are on average 69% more efficient with their wireless spectrum than the market as a whole. And again, let me mention, I'm focusing on the 2 largest because that's the proposal that has been advanced. In fact, the 3 largest are largely indistinguishable in terms of these issues. Under the first scenario, the spectrum deficit would be reduced by 83 megahertz compared to the baseline. And under the second, considering all the different providers, if you excluded the two largest providers, the spectrum deficit would increase by 46 megahertz. Under these assumptions, again, we then go back and do another indifference curve. It shows that the first scenario would save network expenditures about $26 billion, while the second would increase those costs by about $16 billion. Now, what does this mean? It's just numbers. And big numbers usually don't, it's very hard to grasp the meaning of big numbers, at least for me. It means that excluding the two largest carriers would raise network costs by $8 to $16 billion, while allowing them to purchase all the spectrum would reduce those costs by $5 to $26 billion. Restrictions in between these hypothetical extremes would produce proportionate additional costs or savings. So what difference does that make? The fact is the additional costs would be passed on in higher charges for businesses and consumers. This is particularly significant right now because we are in the transition from 3G to 4G LTE technologies and infrastructure. And those transitions have significant economic effects. In a previous study, Kevin Hassett from the American Enterprise Institute and myself analyzed the jobs effect of the transition from 2G to 3G. That is, was there an impact as people, in effect, gave up cell phones and adopted smartphones? That was the essence of that transition. We expected to find some effect because we knew that smartphones were being used in businesses and they would have an effect. And it was the beginning of the app era. Many of them targeted to business-related or commerce-related uses. In fact, we found quite a large effect. We found that from 2007 to 2011, each 10 percentage point increase in the adoption of 3G was associated with an additional 231,690 jobs. It's a lot of jobs for a shift in the gadget that we all carry. We also found that at the end of these data sets that we were using, we were beginning to see transitions from 3G to 4G, and it appeared from the beginning of that transition that that transition was generating similar employment benefits as the transition from 2G to 3G. This should be unsurprising. Again, these technologies have not only spurred the development of tens of thousands of new applications and businesses to provide and operate them. More important, again, the uses of these applications makes people in business more efficient and more innovative. You can do things, businesses figure out new ways of their employees conducting business because everyone has these devices. And that enhanced efficiency and innovation produces jobs. So now we took the additional spending or savings on network infrastructure associated with restricting or not access to additional spectrum, and we projected the increase in charges required to cover those costs. It turns out, barring the participation by the two largest providers, would raise prices by about 9%, monthly charges for 4G use by 2017. Now we have lots of studies that analyze how prices affect people's readiness to buy these new devices. We call it elasticity of demand. And as the price goes up, you lose some customers. As the price goes down, you gain some customers. That's very routine. And based on the elasticities of demand for wireless devices, we estimate that those higher prices would slow the adoption of 4G by about 7 million subscribers by 2017. And now, if we apply the employment analysis of the job impact of the transition from 2G to 3G and 3G to 4G. This suggests that the expected delay in the broad adoption of 4G created by the higher prices driven by the additional spending that would be required if the two largest providers were barred from buying additional spectrum will mean about 38,000 fewer jobs in 2014, about 60,000 fewer jobs in 2015, 86,000 in 2016, and 118,000 in 2017. Our conclusion from all this, don't interfere with a market that's working very well in the name of purported benefits that have yet to be demonstrated. Thank you.
Okay. Doug?
Thank you. I'm here to talk about the budgetary implications of restrictions on the auction, and I want to begin by thanking John and the Georgetown Center on Business and Public Policy for this, and Rob for calling up and asking me to join this project. I mean, you can imagine how this goes, right? What's going to happen to auction revenues? Get the budget guy, so here I am. And the presentation is very straightforward from that perspective, but it's built on a pretty detailed empirical analysis of 5 previous auctions and some theoretical work on the way auction participants might behave. And in that work, I owe a considerable debt, both intellectual and for the work hours put into it, to my co-author, Coleman Bazelon. And I encourage you to take a look at the paper. I'm going to just go over the highlights, but these numbers aren't pulled out of thin air. The question is, what happens to auction revenues if you place restrictions on the 2 largest providers? And remember, those auction revenues in the background are being raised not for their own good, but to accomplish 2 public policy purposes. Number 1, to provide the funding for the first responders emergency network, so-called FirstNet, and number 2, to repurpose the spectrum from broadcast to wireless broadband purposes, the economic value of which is the subject of Rob's paper. But the revenues are really there to do that, and the question is, what happens to your ability to accomplish these public policy objectives if you change the rules of the game in the auction? As a benchmark, we estimate that the full auction, a so-called liberal auction in the Coasian tradition, would raise about $31 billion. And then we ask the question, what happens if you restrict the participation of the 2 largest providers? And to answer that question, you have to imagine, well, take them out, how much money would be taken out? Second question you'd have to answer would be, well, there are going to be other people in this auction. They might actually spend more in the absence of those bidders. So how much of the money that's taken out by restricting them can you get in the way of offsets from other auction participants? And thus on net, what's going to be the budgetary and auction implications of the rules for the auction? So we go through, and if you look at previous auctions, it's pretty clear that the notion that you would send your auction team off with a budget to bid on in the auction is very clearly supported by the data. So you can look in the data, look at the various participants, and very quickly they're bidding up to a fixed amount that looks to be their budget, and they're not going above it, and they're bidding right there, but they don't win all their bids, and so we know what their budget is roughly by staring at the data. We know what they actually won, and so we know what the gap is, what the excess might be that would be available to fill in should we take the 2 largest ones out. And so we go through the analysis, and pretty quickly you find out that if you pulled out the top 2, you would lower the auction revenues, but with the offset, you lower it by about 40%. So we go from about $31 billion in auction revenues down to about $19 billion in auction revenues. Now, to sort of focus this on the real questions, which is what's the right public policy and what would you accomplish with that, remember that the FirstNet costs are estimated at about $7 billion. It's about $2 billion ballpark estimate for some of the conversion costs. And so if you take that $9 billion out of your auction revenues, you have about $10 billion left for the purpose of getting spectrum from broadcast over to wireless broadband, and it raises the question whether that would be enough to accomplish your public policy objectives. So that's the sort of headline result, which is you're going to get about a 40% reduction from a full exclusion of the top two providers. You could, of course, have partial exclusions, and there, given the nature of how that's written, you'd get a lot of different answers. We don't pretend to have a number for every possible set of exclusions you might dream up, but it does appear that at some point, restricting more and more, it gets quite critical. Our ballpark estimate is once you restrict the largest two from about a third of the spectrum up for bid, you start to have a significant impact on the auction revenues. You start to get closer to that $19 billion number than the $31 billion number. And so we were really pleased to be able to take a look at this. Again, the important thing is not the numbers per se, as Rob has said. What's important is that those numbers are real indicators of the ability to meet the public policy objectives. And they are, in the end, to provide some first responder capability in communications and to move the spectrum from lower value use to higher value use, create value for the nation as a whole. And the auction revenues have to be sufficient to accomplish those purposes. And our reading of the evidence from past FCC auctions is that these kinds of restrictions actually impede the ability to fully meet those objectives, and it'd be unwise to go down that path. And so I'll just stop there, and we can have a discussion and answer the questions.
Okay, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Doug. We have some time to let the authors of the study field some questions. We're being taped, and so if what you could do is just simply identify yourself, who you're with, and address the question to the authors. That would be great. As we used to say in Arkansas, who wants to bring us out of the barn? Yes. No, you didn't do what I said. What did I say? What did I? No, you don't have to speak to a microphone, but you do have to say who you are. Thank you.
I did get up at 3 this morning. I'm Anna Marie Kovacs, and I'm with the center. And thank you both for your comments. Doug, one of the points you made in the paper that was particularly striking to me was that we might wind up not only with less money, but less spectrum if you exclude the two largest players. And I wonder if you could have a little bit of that.
Well, I think that's actually the central point. I mean, everyone likes, and as a former CBO director, I love it when people talk about the budget, but that's really not the central issue. The central issue is getting the spectrum from broadcasters into the wireless broadband place. And people have different notions, and I think Rob's thought harder about this than I have, about what's enough. There are different measures of sort of the shortfall, but I don't think anyone woke up and thought, well, 10 billion is exactly the right number to accomplish our public policy objectives. And I think that's what jumps out of the paper, so we're not going to get there with that kind of an auction.
Yes, sir.
David Balto, antitrust attorney. What are the measures short of an absolute ban that could be considered that might address some of these issues, and what would be the effect of some of those interim measures? And not a complete ban.
So, well, go ahead.
Well, you might set a limit based on some share of the current share of spectrum which the large providers have, so that if one provider has today 35% of the spectrum, you might say that they could not purchase more than 20% of the additional spectrum. I'm pulling those numbers out of a hat, or out of the air, rather. No hats around. And the effects, we would expect that the economic effects would be proportionate and to those measured by the extreme cases of all or nothing. But you know, it's a good question because it's very hard to come up with, in my view, with a reasonable basis for setting that kind of limit. You know, I pulled the numbers out of the air because it's very hard for me to pull it out of the market. The market has produced this allocation based on what different people were willing to spend, not just on spectrum, much more importantly, what they were willing to spend on their infrastructure, and how consumers have responded to that. And we've been running this market test, if you want, for a decade now. It's involving the entire, not just U.S., but global population. And these are the results. So coming up with a limit, to me, would seem necessarily to involve arbitrary decisions which are not really economically based.
Another question in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Nancy Carter Foster, U.S. Fargo Commonwealth. Who funded the study for the Central?
Was sponsored by the Center for Business and Public Policy at Georgetown.
Okay, so they funded it.
Yes.
I got my money from him.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Rachel O'Connell from Yale University. I had a question for Mr. Holtz-Egan. It's regarding that number you brought up about the fact that you would start to see a very large impact on auction revenues if the two largest carriers were prevented from buying more than a third of the available spectrum. And I was just curious, what sorts of reasons would the FCC choose not to use this limit? Basically, whether it's barriers to making this number the limit. Like, for example, allowing them to buy up to 2/3, but not that last third. For example, does this result in like inefficiencies in terms of jobs?
I'm not here to advocate for any limit. I'll be honest. I find the whole notion at odds with both first best reasoning about how you handle a situation like this and also what's going on in the market. You know, if you look at what's actually going on out there, there seems to be vigorous price competition, improvements in quality, lots of innovation, nothing that looks like a market that's hampered by an absence of competitive pressures. And if you did want to have some sort of fix to market competition, deciding ex ante what the business model mix of, you know, towers versus spectrum versus other inputs is a bizarre way to solve a competition problem. So I just wouldn't go down this route myself. I don't think the evidence merits it. It's not the right way to fix it, in my view. So I'm not here to advocate for any of these limits, to be honest. I mean, we did want to see what would happen if you did, and the first order impact is you don't move enough spectrum out of a low value use to a high value use. And that's a loss for society that happens for a long, long time until you fix it. And, you know, that's going to be some serious social losses. That's my kids unable to download things fast enough and me having to put up with them. I mean, I don't want to deal with that. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that goes on.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Phil Grant from Allen Hamilton. I'm curious, other than building on the blanket exclusion point, has there been any serious discussion about linking participation to coverage, specifically in the context of rural markets and cellular market areas? So the concept would be, and I don't know if this has been discussed at all with the FCC, I'm interested in your perspective, since there's clearly a shortfall in coverage in rural CMAs, has there been any serious discussion about making or linking participation to certain coverage metrics? Particularly in the context of FirstNet, because as probably everyone knows, rural coverage remains a significant issue as a public policy. But I guess so, two questions. Are you aware of any discussion on that topic? And what would be some of the economic implications if they went down that route?
So I don't know. In situations like this, I always hide. So Coleman, do you know?
There have always been build-out requirements, not always, but in many licenses, there's been requirements of merchant usage. That's always been a trade-off between the value to the you're trying to get a licensee to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, so it's a cost to them that comes off the front end of the license. So it would depend on how much these restrictions or requirements fit over what they would want to be doing otherwise.
Right. And just a quick follow-up, in terms of economic analysis, to the point about the indifference curve, you know, the cost for carriers, as people know, to bring service out to those more remote CMAs is very significant. So it'd be really interesting analytic to look at that linkage, basically, because of the inefficiencies that exist. There's a reason why the main carriers have not chosen to move toward, 90+% or whatever the number is currently. So just an observation, particularly in the context of FirstNet.
You know, the FCC, as you know, has asked for comments on this, and so we may very well get some discussion of that question. My research associate, who's very, very well versed in this as well, is actually sitting right next to you. Doug, do you know of any discussion of this? It's Doug Dawson.
I don't think the FCC has brought up rural coverage in any of the in designing the incentive auction.
Right.
Except for the possibility of using more spectrum in rural areas where you don't have to.
Another question? Anna Maria.
And I'm still in the center.
Make it a good one.
Seems to me that the proposal to exclude the two largest carriers is essentially a proposal to lower the cost of buying spectrum for everyone else. And there's an assumption that if that's done, then the smaller competitors may not be as well financed, whatever, will now be able to invest more money in the network, will be more willing to bid for spectrum, but also will be able to bid more for the network. And I guess the question I have is, how does one, do you believe that there's actually anything realistic about that assumption? In other words, if you allow a carrier which has a portfolio of other, is part of a larger company, has a portfolio of other businesses, to buy spectrum more cheaply, why wouldn't the parent simply reinvest the money in another country or in another business? So I guess I'm questioning the underlying assumption beneath the whole structure here. Why would we believe that this is actually going to be pro-competitive, disregarding all the stuff you two have talked about?
I agree with you. I think that the proposition that the reason why certain providers don't purchase more spectrum is because they don't have access to the resources to do so, to me it's counterintuitive. Spectrum is the single most valuable resource in the entire economy. And there are lots of people prepared to help finance the purchase of spectrum with a good business plan to use it. And so I think people purchase the amount of spectrum that they think they can profitably use, and that the two largest providers are purchasing more because they believe they can make more profitable use out of a larger amount of spectrum. So I agree with you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Matthew Hussey with the FCC. I noticed you did historical analysis of previous domestic auctions, but did you look at recent international auctions, whether it's France, Germany, Canada, or UK, that have, some have proposed, different ways, whether it's to build out rural areas, to look at ways to incentivize new entrants in the market, and the impact that those parameters on their auctions impacted revenues?
Not in any detail for this paper. I mean, we really did focus on the U.S. market with a particular eye toward trying to identify the kinds of budgets that would be available and the extent to which they were fully exploited in the bidding. And that's the experience that's most relevant for this auction, so we focused on that.
The lessons, say, from Canada, where they had bans at the incumbents could not bid on. It was a similar experience that the U.S. had in previous auctions where there was licenses put aside that the incumbents couldn't bid on in an auction where the incumbents could bid. And it seems that in general, all that does, because you're only taking a small amount to set aside in the context of a bigger auction, is it allows the entrance to strategy of bidding up the value of the licenses that the incumbents can buy, and then they get their licenses for less. But it's not clear that the net effect on total auction revenues was up or down. It's more just the entrance rate will squeeze the money out of the incumbents. But that's in the context of a small set aside. It's not. That probably wasn't changing the total outcome of how much spectrum we got.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Ben Kaufman from Senator Menendez's office. I was just wondering if there's a way to get information on how these different proposals will affect the states economically or regions. So we could get kind of a sense.
We haven't done that analysis, but I mean, in principle, you could certainly do the employment analysis by state because the data sets are by state. And we can look at the data sets, but as of now, it hasn't been done.
May I add? It's a great question. I think the first step you do beyond the study that has been done by the center is to start looking at the intensity of high-tech employment in particular states. States that are a bit more high-tech are going to have bigger job impacts. States that are a little lower tech are going to have lower impacts. That would be a first rough cut at that, but you could then roll it out in a little more sophisticated way. But that would be a first cut, and I think you could probably overlay that pretty quickly on top of this analysis. Other questions? Does everybody know everything there is to know about spectrum policy at this point? I want to make sure we all know everything before we leave the room. All right. Let me, on behalf of the center, thank both Rob Shapiro, Doug Holzeken, Coleman Baslam for doing this study for us. Thank you very much for coming. The study is available in hard copy. There are some hard copies here at the outside the room. There are also copies, for those of you who want to save the planet, on our website, the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is cbpp.georgetown.edu.
Is there a mobile app?
No mobile app. You had to embarrass me. Well, all right. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.